So I decided to do a screencast on the way I used to think about special ed and special ed law. And after taking this course, now how I view some of the specific topics that I was kind of more surprised about than others. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with that. So the first two things that were kind of eye-opening to me. I've already taken school law, EDU 550 with Mike Cormier 3 years ago, and I was made aware. We talk a little bit about special ed law, but not very much. And I remember hearing about free and free and appropriate public education, and I guess it was so long ago, and I don't typically work directly in the special ed setting aside from providing accommodations to students. So that FAPE kind of just like, I guess, left my mind, I guess, a little bit. So what I used to think was that a free and appropriate public education pertains to all students. All students have the right to have that. And now I have obviously learned more, reminded myself that free and appropriate public education only pertains to special education students. So that was a good reminder there. Is minor and basic as that might be, it was just a good refresher. And then in terms of least restrictive environment, to me, my mind, when I first hear about that, it reminds me of students being in the general classroom setting, and not necessarily the way I think now, which I know that under the least restrictive environment, it provides special education students the opportunity to learn in whatever setting is most suitable for their needs. So, for example, the student that I talk about an awful lot in my journals and even in my discussions, I talked about him in the last journal, Journal 6, where he is now moving to a new placement this year. He's actually going to be right next to my classroom, and I had the privilege of having my classroom next to him last year too. So I'm excited to have him back again. I actually got moved in the middle of the year last year, so I haven't been near him again, but they're hoping that this new placement is obviously a much better choice for him. And so, over time, I'm sure the special ed director and IEP team will review how that situation is working out for him. But that's the situation, that's the least restrictive environment for him that's going to allow him to not necessarily be in the general education setting, but it's the setting that's most suitable for his needs. And he's, again, just a reminder, he's an autistic child, totally nonverbal, and has become more combative and aggressive as he's gotten older. He's now a teenager. So I'm excited to see how this new placement works for him. And then another topic that for me was, I used to think one way and now I think totally differently in terms of access to the general curriculum. In the past, I used to think that it meant that, okay, special ed students have certain accommodations, modifications. Maybe I provide them with, an audio version of what I just did in class because they are, have trouble seeing something. So hearing it is more beneficial for them, and vice versa. Maybe they have difficult hearing what I'm saying or understanding how I'm saying it, especially in the Spanish classroom. So I provide them with visual notes. Maybe they're, having trouble. They have some sort of visual impairment. So they have preferential seating or a behavioral issue, which would require that as well. Or maybe they're one-on-one and they have an ed tech with them. That's what my perception of access to the general curriculum meant. And now I know that it's much more than just the four walls of a classroom or just providing modifications that might occur in a classroom. So, for example, the tutoring services that happen for a student, even if they have a discipline issue, and they're no longer in school by law, we still need to provide them, those students, with access to the general curriculum. So even if, they're suspended or removed from the general education setting, um, by law, we still need to, make sure that they have access to all of that. And then the last piece that was also a very kind of aha moment for me was the student behavior and discipline. And I think I read it in one of the articles, is that people kind of go along with the assumption that, special ed students can't get in trouble because it's part of, they're exempt from getting in trouble. And I kind of fell into that trap. I mean, even as an educator, I really didn't know much about how much, a student could get disciplined for whatever behavioral issue they're having. So I fell into that trap along with everybody else. But now I realize that, everyone can, if a student gets in trouble in my classroom, regardless of whether they have a disability or they don't, I kind of move it along and I check in after the fact, but move it along to the, the next steps, the next place that it needs to go. And not that I forget about it, I do check in, but I don't know. I guess I just never focused on it as much as I am for this class. So I realize now that all students can be disciplined, but students who do have that behavioral issue, like I had mentioned on the previous slide, they have specific guidelines that need to be followed in order for them to receive that free and appropriate public education. So in one of my journals, I talked about a student who, when my principal, Mr. Brown, when he came on board 4 years ago, there was a student who, by court order, was no longer allowed to be on school property. However, by law, we also needed to provide him with a free and appropriate public education. So the school offered homebound tutoring services so that he could graduate, and he actually did go on to receive his diploma. So, that was one example that I was shocked. I didn't know that by law, in that situation, again, especially for that particular situation, because the student was no longer in the building, I didn't really realize, because I didn't directly work with him anymore, what ended up happening and what that big picture kind of looks like when he's no longer in the building, but what our obligations are as well. And so finally, this exercise, just being able to reflect on what I had previously thought about and what I now think, I think is beneficial for myself, especially to talk about it. So that's why I chose this medium. And for me, I'm all about like the laws that I learn about or situations that I read about and how that compares and contrasts to my own setting. Was it something that I've seen before? Is it something that, might happen in a much larger district? But our population of special education students is 13%. So I do think a lot of the situations do apply to us. And it's interesting for me to connect that back to the setting in which I work. And so for me, the biggest takeaway for me also has been at the very beginning of the course when I watched that horrible video on Willowbrook. And then the next topic was social maladjustment and where we actually are today. So as the course transpired, where the early days of the Willowbrook treatment and the rights that special education students have now, thankfully, has grown tremendously. And I do think we have, there's always room for improvement. I think we have a long way to go in some areas, but certainly have been moving in the right direction. And I know that when I looked at the accountability matrix as part of my final journal, I was astounded at the dropout rate. So that was one of the pieces that I would feel that we as the state of Maine could really work on. Is I obviously need some more information. I talked about that in my journal because I don't know the reasons as to why students have dropped out. That information hasn't been shared. However, I do think as a state that 18% is still too high to see these students with disabilities dropping out. So that's something that I would be interested in finding more about. So thank you for the opportunity to take this course. It's been really, really informational for me, and I appreciate it. Thank you.